we'll be continuing the series and we'll be talking about the canons of taxation, as we were discussing about our canons of taxation, and the first very canon of taxation that we discussed, which is your canon of economy. The second canon of taxation is your canon of equality. So we say economic justice should prevail, and it should prevail as per ability to pay and with respect to, in proportion to the respective abilities. That means what is, we say that there should be a canon of equality. That means there should be tax equity, which we discussed right now, that there should be a fair distribution of the tax burden among different taxpayers. So when we say that, talking about Indian income tax structure, it follows this very canon of equality, wherein we are following a practice wherein we are following this principle of ability to pay. That means the higher the level of the income of a person, the greater share of taxes he or she will pay. So that means we in practice, in reality, we are using this very principle of canon of equality, wherein we are talking about that every person will pay as per his or her abilities to pay. So we see that there being, let's suppose any person, he is earning more, that means he'll be paying a greater share of your taxes, right? So that is what we say, that yes, we are using this canon of equality, which is a must for any tax structure. Third comes your canon of certainty. So that means the taxes which any individual is bound to pay, they ought to be certain. They need not to be arbitrary. That means there should be this canon of certainty. That means this time of payment, the manner of payment, the date of payment, the quantum of amount that is to be paid, they need to be very clear to the contributor, right? Imagine आपके एम्प्लॉयर को पता ही नहीं है कितने टैक्सेस डिडक्ट करने हैं, आपको पता नहीं है कि आपने अपनी रिटर्न कब फाइल करनी है, अगर आपको ये आइडिया नहीं है कि एडवांस टैक्सेस कब फिल करने हैं, पेनल्टी जो है अगर आप टाइम पर पे ऑफ नहीं करेंगे तो उसका क्या रेपरकशन होगा, क्या कॉन्सिक्वेंसेस होंगे. एंड इमेजिन इफ यू डोंट नो विच इज द पोर्टल टू पे द टैक्सेस, विच इज योर लास्ट डेट एंड व्हाट इज द अमाउंट ऑफ योर टैक्सेशन, व्हाट आर द मोड्स ऑफ पेमेंट, राइट, then there will be lot of chaos, there will be ambiguity. So this very canon of certainty says that whatever amount an individual is bound to pay, that should be clear, that should be very certain. It should not be based on any arbitrary approach. Rather, everything should be clear to the contributor. So if the banks are supposed to deduct the taxes onto your FDR, if they exceeds a certain amount, then that also is very clear, right? And similarly, you are aware about your last dates to pay the taxes, you are aware about your rate of structure, you are aware about your portals, you are aware about your payment modes. So that is a canon of certainty. That means this is a very core characteristics of any taxation structure, which our Indian Income Tax Act 1961 also follows, and which talks about that yes, there is a certainty. We are very clear on to that, okay, how much contribution is to be done, how much payment is to be made, and what is the last date to make the payment. So that means we are very clear on to this very part of our certainty. The last very canon of taxation, which has been proposed by Adam Smith, is canon of convenience. It says every tax should be most likely to be convenient. If put on luxuries, choice to buy or not is there. That means what? That आपका हर एक tax structure convenient होना चाहिए. There should not be any mandatory, provisions which says that, okay, it is compulsory for you to pay taxes onto that. No, if you are not buying out the luxuries, you are not required to pay a higher rate of GST. Higher rate of your GST, which is your 28%, it will be only applicable if you are buying some luxurious goods, right? So that choice to buy a good or not, it is on to you. Because according to the type of good that you are buying, you have to pay the corresponding charges, right, as your tax amount. So that sort of convenience is available to the people. So if you are buying a slipper which is less than 500, you are not supposed to pay any GST. But if you are buying a slipper which is costing you 5 to 10,000 bucks, so that means you are buying a luxurious choice, so you are simply required to pay the GST onto the same. Right. Similarly, if you are, buying the vegetables which are there available onto carts, available on by any hawker, right, vegetable hawker or sellers. So therein you would see never there being your GST being implemented onto the same. But yes, of course, if your vegetables are processed, they are frozen ones, so you are supposed to pay the GST onto the same. So that's a choice, that's a canon of convenience. So when we talk about Indian taxation structure, we follow all the characteristics that have been proposed by Adam Smith, which talks about your economy, which talks about equality, certainty and convenience. So that makes it a good tax structure, and such a tax structure which is very easy to rely upon, which is easy to comply with, which is effective and efficient, right? Now there's another theory which has been proposed by Musgravian, and this Musgravian, he thinks that what should be the good tax system like, what should be its characteristics, right? So he proposed certain characteristics of a good tax system. Number one, he says it should be equitable. As our canon of economy also floats for the same, that there should be this canon of equitability. That means this tax equity should prevail, whether vertical equity, whether horizontal equity. We should have such a tax structure wherein this taxes should be paid as per the ability to pay principle, and there should be a fair distribution of taxes among different classes of taxpayers. So if a person who is poor, so then he will be supposed to pay the lesser amount of taxes, whether we talk about the direct taxes or indirect taxes. But when we talk about a person who is earning great, right, let's suppose he is a millionaire, so he is supposingly required to pay a greater share of taxes. Similarly, the second characteristic of a good tax system is minimizes interference with tax burden. That means there should be as much as possible the least interference with the tax burden, right? There should not be any ambiguity, there should not be any excessive burden onto either the consumer or to the producer, right? As much as possible, there should be minimum interferences. Similarly, it talks about the third characteristics of a good tax structure, which is, it says, if given for providing investment incentives, it should be done with the minimum interferences and with equity in the system. That means if you are getting any opportunity for investments, incentives, they are as much as possible the less complicated structure. And more it should talk about the tax equity principle. Then only will we say that okay, this tax structure is it's a good one, it's an ideal one, right? Similarly, the tax system should be such that it is able to facilitate the use of fiscal policy for stabilization and growth objectives. That means आपका tax structure ऐसा होना चाहिए which is propelling such fiscal policies that brings more of stabilization, that brings more of such objectives which aligns with the growth of the economy. So that means your tax system should be structured in such a manner which is having as much as possible the tax equity, as much as possible economical, because economical herein also, Musgravian also talks about the same, and it says that it should be these compliance cost for the taxes and the administrative cost for the taxes should be the least. That means अगर आपको tax भरने में एक अच्छा खासा amount pay off करना पड़ रहा है, then we say that no, it's not a good tax system. अगर आपको हम कह रहे हैं कि in order to file your return ITR1 which is a very simpler return और आपको उसके लिए भी CA के ऊपर rely करना पड़ रहा है या आपको उनको एक hefty amount देना पड़ रहा है, then we don't classify it as a good tax system. That is why the government says okay, are present day ITRs, they are digitalized. You can, file in by yourself, or you can go to these mitras which have been, designated by the government for the help. So your compliance cost should not be much. It should be the least possible. Then only we classify it as a good tax system, right? Now, we have talked a lot about the tax equity and its relevance in propelling the growth of a nation, and its different segregations and various principles that we deploy for this taxation structure, and talking about how the good tax structure should be like, right? The next we are going to talk about the tax incidence. Now, what is the tax incidence? What do we mean by it? We basically mean that who will bear the burden of taxes, right? There are two people. There may be cases where it can be two people. One who bears the initial impact of the taxes, and the second person, which is the final resting place. That means the person from whom the taxes cannot be shifted further. It cannot pass on to C or D, right? It may have levied on to A, and from A it has passed down on to B, but it cannot be shifted further. So herein we talks about that this is the initial impact on A, and ultimately the impact has been passed on to B. So he bears the ultimate burden of tax, which is known as your tax incidence, right? So this person onto whom these taxes being, they cannot be shifted further, or who is bearing the ultimate burden of taxation, we say tax incidence falls onto this person B, right? So when we say that, let's suppose in case of your indirect taxes, as it always happens, the initial impact is on someone else and the ultimate burden of taxation is borne by the consumer. So that is the final resting place of a burden is not onto the same person at first instance onto whom it has been imposed, right? So whenever we talk about these tax incidents, we say that these taxes are imposed, and the impact of these taxes is that the real disposable income of the person onto whom this tax incidence is being, imposed, his disposable real income will reduce. What will happen? Agar aapka tax hai, let's suppose some taxes have been implemented or imposed onto the sugar mill, right? Sugar mill वाला क्या करेगा? वो taxes को आगे further अपने price inflate करके वो आगे pass on हो जाएगा consumer तक, right? This is how it moves like. So what will happen? The real disposable income after, setting up for all the expenses of the person who is bearing the tax, it will reduce down, right? That is how we say that, okay, this real income has reduced because of there being, reduction in the disposable, या तो उसकी disposable income कम हुई है, या फिर हम कह रहे हैं कि there being rise in the direct taxes or rise into the prices of the product, due to which his income, ultimate disposable real income is reduced because the prices of the products have increased due to a corresponding rise in the indirect taxes. So जब आपके indirect taxes rise हो रहे हैं, price of the product आपका बढ़ेगा, and उसका impact क्या पड़ेगा down the line? The consumers have to bear the brunt of the same, which means that their real disposable income will reduce. So this is the formula which you can see onto your screen, which is a Musgravian formula, and which talks about the disposable real income. It talks about the impact of your direct and indirect taxes, and it talks about that how reduction in disposable money income happens because of your direct taxes, and reduction in your disposable money income also happens because of the changes that happens into the price of the product because of the indirect impact of the taxes that is being implemented onto the producer of the goods. So that's a Musgravian formula to talk about how do we compute our disposable real income, and it talks about both your direct taxes and your indirect taxes. They have a major impact onto the disposable real income which a person is having in hand, right? Now we say these changes in the income, they operate onto the earning side of the household also, right? जब हम बात कर रहे हैं कि आपका total incidence of taxes on an individual, we say that as an individual he is bearing the burden what has been levied onto himself directly, and plus summation the tax burden which the producer is bearing, and ultimately he is passing off that burden to whom? The consumer. So the total tax incidence is the summation of the impact which he is having directly onto his income, real income, and the impact through these rise in the prices, right? Now, what is the purpose of this incidence analysis? This incidence analysis is basically to track down the individuals whose real incomes are being truncated when these, taxes are imposed. So we basically do what is, we analyze the impact of incidence analysis to see upon that, okay, what has been the ultimate impact onto the households or onto the individuals whose incomes are being truncated because of the rise in the taxes, right? So this will help you in analyzing the impact of your taxes on different economic classes of the nation. So we can see the rise of the impact of the rise in the prices of the product on a middle class person in a different manner. Similarly, the impact onto a lower income group in a different manner, upper middle class on a different note, and your higher end consumers on a different way. So this way it will help you analyze that, okay, who all are the classes, economic classes in the nation who are bearing more of the burden of your these taxes, and that is being done through incidence analysis only. Now when we say that types of your tax incidents, we basically categorize them into four subcategories. The first one is your statutory tax incidents, which talks about that there is a legal placing of tax liability. That means who will bear the burden of taxation onto the first instance. So I've given you this example of a person who's operating these sugar mills, right? So government has done what is, government has, let's suppose, imposed the taxes onto this sugar mill because he's producing the goods, he's supposed to pay the taxes to the government, then only this circular flow of the economy will move on, right? And that will have a filter down effect onto the bottom of pyramid, that they are going to ultimately benefit from those taxes. So if those taxes are being implemented on a sugar mill, so you would see the taxes being implemented onto this sugar mill, it is a statutory tax incident because they are going to ultimately pass on the burden to the final resting place, which is the consumer. And when it passed down onto the consumer, it is known as your economic incidence of taxes because of that transaction of sale and purchase that happened between the owner of the sugar mill and the ultimate consumer. So due to that, there is the further shifting of the taxes from one point to another point. So the first point onto whom it has been imposed by the government, it is known as statutory tax incidence, and to the second person it has been passed down by your producer by inflating the prices of the product, it is known as the economic tax incidence, right? Another categorization we have is with respect to absolute and relative tax incidence. Now what are these absolute taxes? It means the amount of income which is surrendered as taxes by income receivers. So that's an absolute amount that you pay off to the government, and it is with comparison to your relative measure, wherein we say that proportion of income paid, that what is the proportion of income that you are paying up, that proportion is a very relative number. The amount that you are paying, it is an absolute figure that you are paying off, surrendering as taxes by the person who is receiving the income, right? But the proportion of income which you are paying as taxes, it's a relative measure and it may keep on changing. Sometimes you are ending up paying 10% of your income, sometimes you are paying 9%, or maybe sometimes you will pay off 12% of your income. So that's a relative measure. And absolute, that means every time you are paying off 5,000 as a flat amount of your taxes to the government. So that's the difference between the absolute measure of your tax incidence and the your relative measure of your tax incidence. Now, when we say that this tax shifting happens and the burden it passes on from the producer to the consumer. So we talk about that, it can be forward also or it can be backward in the supply chain also, because it depends on to the scenarios, and accordingly it can be gauged upon that, okay, this is your forward, impact that the taxes have been, shifted on to the forward stage of the supply chain. And similarly, you can see the degree and the direction of to which these taxes can be shifted. That means आप इन taxes को कितना shift कर सकते हैं, कितना ये shift नहीं हो सकते, वो depend करता है elasticity of demand and supply के ऊपर. There are other measures also. Time period कितना है, coverage of taxes कितना है. So it is not always the case कि हमेशा, then तो there will be one scenario कि producer हमेशा जो है, जैसे ही taxes उसके ऊपर implement हुए या उसकी cost बढ़ी, तो उसने जो pass on कर दिया impact किस पे, consumer पर. तो वो ऐसे easily possible नहीं है, because that depends on to your elasticity of demand and supply. And जो tax incidence होगा वो भी relative है, इसके ऊपर depend करेगा that what is the price elasticity of your supply and demand. Now, when we say that कि जो भी part of your market, whether it is the producers or the consumers, जो भी ज़्यादा inelastic होगा, that means which is not able to change, so the tax burden will fall onto the most inelastic side of the market. And if we say, let's suppose अगर आपका demand is more inelastic than supply, that means आपका demand जो है वो change नहीं कर रहा है, supply change हो रहा है, but you are having a constant demand and it doesn't matter to you whether price changes upwards or downwards, it is not changing your demand for the product. So in that case, when the demand of the product is not getting changed because it is very inelastic as compared to your supply, so here in this case, the consumers will bear the most of the tax burden, right? You can see this figure wherein there is, elastic supply and there is inelastic demand. Now you can see it from this very figure that the demand is very inelastic in nature. That means whatever being the changes into the prices, there will be no impact onto the demand of the product. So in that case, the entire burden of the taxation will fall onto the shoulders of your consumers because that demand is not changing, right? So the supply have the full part to, play out with the prices. So that means, this being said that whatever being the inelastic side of the market, it will have to bear the larger share of the, taxes. Similarly, अगर आपका supply inelastic होता है demand के comparatively, then the sellers will bear the burden of those taxes. Now again into this figure you can see inelastic supply and the elastic demand. So the supply जो है आपकी इस केस में वो बिल्कुल inelastic है, यानी कि वो चेंज नहीं हो रही है. So इस केस में जो बर्डन है किसके ऊपर पड़ेगा? बर्डन पड़ेगा प्रोड्यूसर्स के ऊपर, बिकॉज सप्लाई कांस्टेंट है, यानी कि कम इन ज्यादा नहीं हो रही. रीजन बिंग देयर बिंग मेनी प्रोड्यूसर्स ऑफ द प्रोडक्ट, राइट. सो उसका जो है आपका बर्डन जो है इस केस में दी will be more on to your suppliers, right, the producers. So that means we can see on to that there being a major impact of your forces of demand and supply, right. And the tax incidence, it will depend, as I say, onto these price elasticity of your supply and demand. And when the demand is inelastic, so the consumers will be more, unresponsive to the price changes, and the quantity that they demand, it will be the constant. So that is why they have to bear the more brunt of your taxation structure. Because in case of your cigarettes, you would see, or alcohol, you would see, the demand is inelastic, right? Or in case of certain grocery products, you would see that consumers are somehow used to the product, and therein the seller can easily pass on the tax burden to the consumer by enhancing the prices. So that will not lead to much of a decline into the equilibrium quantity that the sellers are selling off. So that ways you can see upon that the entire forces of your demand and supply, they decide upon that who will bear the more of the burden of your taxes, whether they are the producers or the consumers. And the second point on to the same, whatever side is more inelastic in nature, they will bear the most of the tax incidence. So basically your tax incidence is all about who will bear the more of the burden of taxes, right? So if in case you are having any queries, you can write down a mail, you can post down a comment, and we can get back to you. And that's it for the day, and we'll be continuing about more and more topics with respect to the tax structure in the coming segments. So thank you.